gave abandon ship. And
did you actually hear that order, or?
I never heard it,
no.
because at the time that I was given the first torpedo that hit us, it hit just below the 4-inch gun deck virtually, and the water that came up from that explosion just drenched our gun with water. And I just happened to be away from the side of the gun, and this water fell down on me like a deluge and almost forced me to the knees, you know, on the deck with the weight of it. Then the captain of our gun told me we were not getting any 4-inch ammunition coming up through our hoists. So he told me to go and find out why. So I went forward towards the sick bay area to get into a hatch to go down to the magazine, find out what was the matter. I got as far as the sick bay, and it had been hit by a shell fire, and there was just complete pandemonium there. There was bodies lying around, 1 or 2 crew running around, there was no lights. I think there was a little fire in the background that I was conscious of, and I wasn't getting anywhere, so I thought, well, I can't get down to the gun deck. So I went back to my gun to tell him, and on the way back I heard someone say, just as I got to the gun, abandoned ship's been given. And my gun's crew was still milling around there on the gun. I said, then they all started to abandon the place, so I thought, well, it's no time for me to go. So I moved down to the quarterdeck then, off the 4-inch gun deck, which was my abandon station. When I got down there was probably a dozen sailors down there unlashing a Carly float that was tied down to the quarterdeck, plus about 10 or 12 what became known as pilgrim rafts. We'd take them off from the Batavia and put on the Perth, and we unlashed them. And just after that, the 4th torpedo hit us on the port side. The next 2 actually hit on the port side. And so the ship was, by this time, was heeling over to the port, and slowed right down considerably in its way. Anyway, everyone was jumping over as we let go all these rafts and whatever. So I went over to the side of the ship and decided I had to jump. So I took off my anti-flash gear and my tin hat and jumped. Threw my tin hat ahead of the ship, where I was standing, thinking I might hit something hard. But I never, just seemed to hit water, so I jumped in after it. And I took my boots off soon after I got into the water, and eventually came across a couple of rafts, I suppose. It must have been on a Japanese ship, because all it consisted of was 2 44-gallon drums lashed together with 6-inch planks, top and bottom.
Can I just ask another question? When you jumped into the water, what height?
I would have been, I suppose, it was still heeling a little bit to port, so I might have had to jump 10 foot to get into the water. And I jumped outward because I could see the bottom of the side of the ship, you know. So I had to jump outwards to avoid that. But it would have been about an 8 or 10 foot drop, I suppose, into the water.
Sorry for the interruption.
Normally, if it had been just normal on a level keel, it would only have been about 6 foot. So it was starting to heel over, and the way on it was very, very slow. We wouldn't have been doing 2 knots, I wouldn't think, you know, in the speed. So that was when I jumped over. And you could still see other guns firing in the distance, Japanese ships. The American cruiser was obviously firing at them still, because she was still afloat, but she was on fire. And you could see her, she looked to be about a mile away, I suppose, at that time. And you could see her guns from her going towards the Japs, and the Japs firing towards them. And we were even still being fired on by the Japanese ships. But I never got touched by them. I never, you know, I knew they were hitting the water, but I never got damaged or injured or anything. So I jumped into the water, and a few minutes after I jumped into the water, the Perth disappeared. And I swam around listening to people crying out, and I came across one of these rafts that had these 44-gallon drums, and by this time there was about 6 or 8 blokes hanging on to it. So I stayed with that because it was the only raft I could see that was serviceable. So I stayed with that for quite a while, and then those 44 gallons must have been hit by shrapnel, and they were filling up with water, so they should be starting to sink. So they became useless. So I left them myself at the time. There were still 2 or 3 blokes hanging on it. One bloke in particular, he wasn't very happy with himself. He obviously couldn't swim, or if he could, he wasn't happy. And he was crying out for his life belt because he'd left it on board. And by that time I'd made up my mind. It was just in the distance, you could see the land, I suppose, from just water level. I don't know how long far we would have been, maybe a mile or 2 mile away from the land at that time. And I thought, well, I can swim that far, you know. I felt quite confident and strangely unafraid. So I gave my belt to this bloke that was next door to me. And I then took my overall pants off that I had on, and the shirt that I had on, I took that off. So I was left with my singlet and my underpants and my money belt. And I started to swim towards what I could see thought was the shore. And by this time it was almost daylight, so I'd been in the water probably then for about 4 hours. And it was about daylight. Anyway, I started to swim. I seemed to be making progress. I took off my shirt and my underpants finally, and I then had my money belt on. And then I realised when I got a clearer view of the coast, I wasn't getting anywhere. And I was seeming to be going sideways instead of one way. And that's the first time I became sort of scared that I was not going to make it. So in the distance I could see two other sailors sitting on one of these pilgrim rafts. And I yelled out to help to them. And they saw me, and I waved to them, and they saw me, and they eventually tried to paddle towards me, which they were getting dragged by this current that I was in. And not being able to negotiate their raft too well, they were just going around in circles, and we gradually got closer anyway to one another. And eventually I joined up with this raft and I hung on to that. And about a half an hour after that, there had been a lifeboat off a Japanese warship that had been sunk, had been picked up or had been found by our survivors, some of our survivors, and they'd bailed this thing out. And they'd been taking groups, filling it up with survivors, and taking it over to a Japanese destroyer that was standing by, taking on survivors. Well, I got into this lifeboat with these other 2 chaps, and by this time there were 73 of us in this little 16-foot cutter, about all it was. And wounded and dying men in it, you know. All of us were covered in fuel oil, and we started to row towards the Japanese destroyer. Then it suddenly shot off, and we heard out later on from our survivors who were already on it. The captain apologised for having to leave us because they'd had an air raid alarm and they had to get out of this vicinity, I suppose. So they took off and left us. Well, we had a lifeboat, we had a sail, 4 oars, and a little biscuit tin of stuff there, which was water and biscuits. And we thought, well, you know, we can make it, we can do what the Japs, we'll go, Fremantle will do us, sort of thing, full of bravado. Anyway, we had on board Lieutenant Gillam, an engineer officer off the Perth. Padre Matheson was another officer there. Gavin Campbell was another officer on board.
Did you know he had a broken leg at that time?
Oh yes, I found that later on. Well, I knew on board then too, but I didn't know up till then. And I really didn't grasp the damage that had been done to that until we actually got ashore later on. So he was in a bad way. But 2 blokes, there was an Air Force officer, McDonough, I think his name was, a lieutenant. He died of his wounds, and there was a stoker off the Perth who'd been almost stripped of skin, I think, when he was blown out of the engine room.